"Hi, Tony," I heard her say. Her final words struck me like a blow. "I love you too." I never imagined my wife, Jean, would betray me, not just as a spouse, but as the mother of our children. She uttered, "I love you," to another man, Anthony Miller, her boss, while I was thousands of miles away, working tirelessly to secure our family's future. Their covert weekends, her claims of loneliness, and the lies she fiercely defended shattered the foundation of our marriage. Social media, the inadvertent betrayer, revealed the intimacy she tried to conceal, her hand gently resting on his arm in photographs not meant for me. When I uncovered the depth of her deception, I didn't explode in anger or confront her in haste. Instead, I planned. Revenge wasn't merely a reaction. It became a mission. As Miller's world crumbled, so too did hers. The flight from Singapore to O'Hare International spanned 20 hours, including a layover in Taipei. I traveled in business class, which, though slightly better than economy, offered little solace. It was my birthday, but that mattered little. What preoccupied my thoughts was the impending meeting in Chicago with the head of our international stock and share trading division. Touching down shortly after 8:30 in the morning, I took a shuttle to the Chicago Sheraton Suites. Having reserved the room for the previous night, it was ready upon my arrival. After leaving my bags, I took a refreshing shower and headed to the gym. My routine was deliberate: 30 minutes of weightlifting, followed by 30 minutes on the treadmill. A second shower followed, this time under warm water for nearly 15 minutes before switching to cold, shocking my system awake. April in Chicago was chilly, but I endured the icy blast until my teeth chattered, rewarding myself with a final rinse of warm water. The hotel's restaurants served the American breakfast I had missed during my 4-month absence. Pancakes, eggs, bacon, and sausage, all smothered in maple syrup, paired perfectly with 4 cups of strong coffee. Rejuvenated, I made my way to JP Morgan on Dearborn Avenue for my 10:30 a.m. meeting. Upon arrival, I ascended to the 8th floor, where the private banking suites were located. After presenting my ID, I was escorted to a modest conference room equipped with 2 cameras that scrutinized my every move. Placing my leather laptop bag on the table, I stood by the window, motionless, counting the seconds of my wait. 17 minutes exactly. The discipline I had cultivated during my years in the Far East and Southeast Asia dictated that I show no sign of weakness, regardless of the circumstances. Finally, Joe Rutledge, Vice President of International Stock and Commodities Trading, entered the room, trailed by Samuel Young, our corporate lawyer. Their presence together signaled trouble, and I instinctively knew that I was its focus. Joe wasted no time, skipping pleasantries and pointing to a chair. As both men seated themselves across from me, the atmosphere thickened with unspoken accusations. What happened in Singapore? Joe's tone was sharp, more accusation than inquiry. "We sent you there to help the new team settle down, and instead, you invested $300 million in a new company on the Singapore Stock Exchange that has no proven track record. Just a promising idea." "Yes," I replied evenly. "Yes, what?" He pressed, his face flushing with frustration. "Yes, I did," I confirmed, holding his gaze. His complexion deepened to a furious purple as a vein bulged prominently on his forehead. "Would you care to explain?" "Look, Joe, it's all in my report." The SAA prospectus was outstanding. They adhered to every regulation and assembled a management team with nearly 200 years of combined experience. The project itself has a projected 50-year life cycle, and their figures were vetted by Deloitte and KPMG, I explained. Taking a breath, I continued, "The oceans are overfished. Their aquaculture initiative is one of the best globally, backed by genuine expertise. Then why is their stock price plummeting?" He interrupted, his voice rising. "They launched at $17 a share. Now they're trading at $9.55. He jabbed a finger at the table to underscore his words. "And you bought more?" "Yes, because the stock will recover," I replied calmly. "If it rebounds to $25, as my team and I project, we'll have shares acquired at both $17 and $9.55. That translates to a potential profit of $267 million, almost a 90% return." Joe failed to grasp the broader perspective. Joe, we now own 25% of the company's stock. Of a company that's failing, he retorted, his voice hitting a crescendo. It's failing because companies from China, and to a lesser extent Thailand and Vietnam, are aggressively short-selling, I countered. They aim to damage the company, as it poses a threat to their fishing industries, or acquire it at a bargain to solidify their control over the global fish trade. I punctuated my argument with a firm tap on the table. We need to stick it out? This is a serious mistake, Joe said, shaking his head with evident frustration. This isn't the wild 80s or 90s. We can't afford to gamble like that. We need solid opportunities and a well-balanced approach to risk. It's all in my report, I repeated, maintaining my composure. Your report is nothing but pages of wishful thinking. He snapped back, cutting off any further defense. And regardless, it's no longer just my decision. The board has approved my recommendation. You're out. With those words, the outcome was sealed. Samuel, the corporate lawyer, outlined the terms. I would receive 3 months' salary, nearly 30 days of unused leave, amounting to close to 5 months of pay. Additionally, they would cash out my share options, compensating me for the difference between their initial value and the current market price. In total, I would walk away with nearly $800,000. Financially, it was a generous severance, but the cost to my reputation was immeasurable. My career prospects were reduced to working at places like McDonald's or KFC. By 2 o'clock, the necessary forms were signed, my retirement funds updated, and all company-issued items, including my laptop, were surrendered. Escorted out of the building, I found myself standing on the sidewalk, an empty bag slung over my shoulder. A strange pressure built in my head, threatening to overwhelm me. I hailed a cab, imagining the humiliating scene of collapsing in public as strangers stared. Once back at my hotel room, I reached for a small bottle of whiskey from the minibar. Mixing it with 7-Up and some ice, I took a long sip, knowing full well it wasn't the wisest choice. I sat down to reflect. At 42, I was too young to retire, yet starting over felt daunting. Still, as I considered my limited options, one possibility began to emerge. It was risky, but it also carried the allure of redemption. The question was whether I had the courage to pursue it. If I can't believe in myself, I thought, how can I expect anyone else to? With that resolve, I went shopping. Within an hour, I had a new laptop equipped with Windows 11 and ready to go. I downloaded the tools I needed to manage investments and plugged in a thumb drive containing all my trades from Singapore. By the time I finished setting everything up, I was ready to begin. I checked our savings. $50,000 was available. My investment accounts held another $250,000, though accessing those funds required a day's notice. I initiated the withdrawal process, then sold off some stable stocks. Between my severance package and cashed-out options, I expected to have over $1,200,000 available within 2 days. My plan was to transfer most of it to an offshore trading account with Blue Sky International. It was nearly 9 p.m. by the time I completed everything. I ordered a burger and a beer from room service, then turned my phone on for the first time in over 36 hours. The thought of dealing with messages felt exhausting, so I put it aside and turned on the TV, flipping through the news channels to check on market updates. Finding nothing particularly relevant, I leaned back on the bed. The combination of whiskey, beer, and the heavy meal eventually took its toll, and I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, my jet-lagged body woke me early. After grabbing coffee, I finally switched on my phone, which immediately buzzed with a flood of notifications. Help, Dad. Mom's having a meltdown. That was from Dean and Katie. The message continued, but that was the main thrust. What's wrong with Jean? My father had written. Happy birthday. Why aren't you answering your phone? Came a message from Jean's parents. Happy birthday, Dad. Dean and Katie had texted. Happy birthday, son, my father had added. Happy birthday, little brother, chimed in my sister, Georgia. There were more frantic calls from Dean describing how their mom had been crying, but had eventually calmed down. Jean herself, however, hadn't sent any messages. No birthday wishes. No explanation for her behavior. The silence felt like an intentional dismissal, a statement that I no longer mattered. By 8:30, I was on a flight to Springfield. Taking an Uber home, I arrived to find the house in chaos. Soda cans, plates, and video game paraphernalia were strewn across the living room. The floors looked as though the vacuum cleaner hadn't been used in weeks. The kitchen was even worse than the living room, with a sink overflowing with dirty dishes and a dishwasher crammed full. The trash can was beyond capacity, and its contents had spilled over. After taking my laundry to the basement, I found what seemed like weeks' worth of unwashed clothes piled up. I sorted through the laundry, separating whites and lights from darks, and started the first load. Then I set to work tidying up the house, starting with the living room and kitchen. In the formal lounge, I discovered 2 empty wine bottles and glasses, each bearing traces of lipstick in different colors. Our bedroom was in similar disarray, as though it hadn't been cleaned in ages. I stripped the bed, replaced the sheets, changed the duvet cover, and aired out the room. The kids' rooms, though messy, were in slightly better shape. Bit by bit, I picked up the clutter, put things away, vacuumed the floors, and cleaned surfaces. The trash went out, and after nearly 3 hours of effort, the house was beginning to feel under control again. Finally, I retreated to my study and powered up my laptop. The first thing I checked was the Southeast Asia aquaculture stock. It had dropped to $9.37, a nearly 2-point decline in just one day. I made a mental note to revisit my strategy once my funds cleared and I could act in the market again. Needing clarity, I called my dad. My mother had passed away 5 years earlier from breast cancer, leaving a gap in our family that we all still felt. As we talked, the subject turned to Gene. He mentioned she'd been acting strangely over the last 2 weeks, sad, distracted, and seemingly heartbroken, though there was no clear reason why. Perplexed, I logged into our joint bank account, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Growing more curious, I listened to the messages on our home phone, but they held no surprises either. I folded the freshly dried laundry and decided to check the pantry for dinner ideas. The options were limited. In the garage, I reconnected the battery to my Audi A6, which had been sitting idle during my absence. The engine started without issue, so I drove to the local supermarket to pick up essentials. I bought ingredients for a Thai green curry and jasmine rice, deciding it would be a comforting dish to welcome everyone home. In the kitchen, I cooked the rice with coconut milk and ginger for added flavor. For the curry, I stir-fried chicken strips with zucchini, baby eggplant, lemongrass, minced garlic, fresh Asian basil, coriander, and green chilies. I added coconut milk, green curry paste, lime juice, zest, fish sauce, and a hint of sugar to balance the flavors, letting the mixture simmer until it thickened. As a final touch, I chopped spring onions, coriander, and basil for garnish. The table was set, and I poured myself a beer, savoring it halfway before Gene's car pulled into the driveway. The kids burst through the door, yelling, "Dad's home," after spotting my car outside. They threw themselves into my arms, and I hugged them tightly, kissing them repeatedly. "I missed you both so much," I said, my voice thick with emotion. Tears stung my eyes as Katie clung to me, trembling with quiet sobs. Dean, though calmer, held on firmly, his demeanor showing the beginnings of a young man's composure. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, the three of us wrapped in an unspoken bond of love and relief. When I finally looked up, Jean was standing in the doorway, watching us. Her expression was unreadable, a mix of sadness and something else I couldn't quite place. Tears glistened on her cheeks, and she quickly brushed them away as I stood, still holding the kids. She stepped forward, kissed me softly on the lips, and said, "Welcome home, Adam." Her voice was subdued, and her body language carried an undeniable air of melancholy. She quickly glanced away. "That smells good. What is it?" "It's Thai green curry," I replied. Dean and Katie exchanged puzzled looks. "I don't know what that is, Dad, but it smells amazing," Dean said, smiling as he hugged me again. Katie stayed latched onto me, her small feet dangling. "Go wash up and get ready for dinner," Jean instructed them gently. "You'll have plenty of time with your dad after." As they scampered off, Jean gave me a light hug and kissed my cheek. "You look tired, Adam." She studied me closely, her brows furrowing. "Why are you back so soon?" I thought you'd be gone another 8 weeks. My bosses didn't like some of my plans, I admitted. I lost my job. Her eyes widened in shock. For a moment, her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. That's unfortunate, she finally said. We'll figure it out, I replied, then turned the question back to her. But what about you? She looked at me, and for the first time in 15 years, I felt like I was staring at a stranger instead of my wife. Are you okay? I asked. For a fleeting moment, her eyes seemed to cloud over, but she blinked and straightened her posture. It's work, she said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The market isn't great. That didn't align with what I had heard. There are changes at MRE, she added, her tone growing more serious. Everyone's under a lot of pressure. She gestured vaguely, as if to underscore her point. Before I could press further, the kids came bounding down the stairs, freshly washed and brimming with energy, jumping into my arms again. Jean glanced at us and said, "We'll talk later," before heading into the kitchen. Dinner followed shortly after. I served the food and poured a chilled glass of white wine for Jean and myself. Dean asked for a soda, and Katie opted for water. For the first time in 4 months, we sat down together as a family. As we ate, I regaled the kids with stories from my time in Singapore, sharing anecdotes about team activities like dragon boat racing, indoor golf, and ninja tag. The kids were thoroughly entertained, their laughter filling the room. When dinner was over, Dean and Katie disappeared briefly, only to return with a wrapped gift. "Happy birthday, Dad!" they exclaimed in unison. Jean's hands flew to her mouth, her expression a mix of surprise and guilt. "My God, Adam, I'm so sorry. I completely forgot," she said, her voice tinged with regret. I thought about reminding her how I had gone out of my way to get her special jewelry for her last birthday, but I chose to focus on the kids instead. I opened their gift to find a box set of Band of Brothers, a collection I'd always wanted. Hugging them tightly, I thanked them with a smile that matched their own. Jean, looking visibly embarrassed, said, "I'll get you your gift tomorrow, Adam." I waved it off with a kind smile. There's no need. Just being home with my family is the best gift I could ask for. Dean and Katie cheered, "Love you, Dad," before jumping back into my arms. We stayed at the table for over an hour, chatting until the kids had to retreat to their homework. Jean and I worked together to clean up the kitchen. As we washed and dried the dishes, I turned to her. "What's going on with you, Jean? You seem different." She made a small gesture as if to stop me and sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know, Adam," she said softly. "I just feel down. You're always traveling." This last trip, she hesitated, looking into my eyes. "It was too long. You're not here with us. It feels like we hardly share a life anymore." Tears slipped down her cheeks, and her voice faltered. "I feel lost." I pulled her into a warm embrace. She stiffened at first, but then relaxed into my arms, letting me hold her. I leaned in to kiss her, but she turned her head, resting it against my chest instead. Wrapping her arms around me, she cried quietly, her sadness palpable. We stayed like that for a while, and I wish there were a simple way to mend the growing distance between us. I wanted to kiss her, to reassure her, but it seemed like comfort was what she needed most. She wasn't entirely wrong. Over the past 6 years since my promotion, I had thrown myself into managing young, inexperienced teams and solving their problems. Jean and I had agreed to make sacrifices for a future where we could retire early and enjoy life together. But the toll it had taken on us was clear now. Eventually, she pulled away and said gently, "You should go spend some time with the kids." I started with Katie, helping her with her homework before moving on to Dean. After tucking Katie into bed and kissing her goodnight, I checked in on Dean. He was sitting at his desk, looking worried. "Mom's not okay, Dad," he said quietly. "She's been crying a lot and hasn't been herself. She even forgot your birthday." He glanced toward the door, ensuring we were alone. "I think she's really upset." His voice wavered, and tears filled his eyes. "Please help her, Dad." I nodded, though I didn't entirely understand what was happening or how to fix it. When I went downstairs, I heard Jean speaking in hushed tones on the phone. She must have noticed me because she abruptly ended the call. "Who was that?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "One of the girls from the office," she replied, her tone dismissive. We locked eyes. She wasn't ready to open up, and I could see the frustration she was trying to hide. There was clearly more to the situation, but I was too drained from the day and the lingering fatigue of travel to push further. For now, the unanswered questions would have to wait. At 9:30, I retreated to my study to check the Singapore Stock Exchange. With the time difference, trading had already been underway for a couple of hours. CAA stocks were trading at $9.90, a slight improvement, but far from reassuring. Afterward, I headed upstairs to wait for Jean, who was in the bathroom. She was going through her usual nighttime routine, washing her face, brushing her teeth, and running a brush through her hair. When she finally came into the bedroom, she wore a loose shirt, her typical choice when she bothered to wear anything at all. I cleaned up, brushed my teeth, rinsed my mouth, and slipped into bed. Reaching for her, I felt her body tense momentarily before she softened and nestled into my side. "Please just hold me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I wrapped my arms around her and held her close for what felt like an eternity. This wasn't the Jean I knew. Something was wrong, something that lingered in the unspoken space between us. Was it my long absence? Had she missed me too much and finally reached a breaking point? She had never mentioned it if that were the case. Or was it something worse? Had she fallen out of love with me? Or worse yet, found someone else? A darker thought entered my mind, chilling in its simplicity. What if she was unwell? What if it was something serious, something she couldn't bring herself to tell me? The questions swirled endlessly in my head until exhaustion and the stress of the past few days caught up with me, pulling me into a restless sleep. My dreams were vivid and unsettling. A shadowy figure I could never quite catch seemed to haunt me. I woke at 4:30, groggy and still out of sync with the time zone. Deciding to clear my head, I laced up my running shoes and went for a jog, promising myself to pick up some melatonin later to help adjust my sleep schedule. After an hour, I returned to find Jean had left a note asking me to handle breakfast and school drop-offs for the kids. Still early, I checked my bank account. The funds from JP Morgan had cleared, so I transferred the money into my offshore account. I took another look at CAA stocks. They had fallen further, now trading at $8.99. The descent wasn't a free fall, but it felt as though they were riding a slow escalator down. I faced a difficult choice. Should I focus on salvaging my financial future or on rebuilding my marriage? Could I do both? Over breakfast, I made an effort to connect with Dean and Katie, asking them about their lives during my absence. Their stories were simple and sweet. Mini golf games, trips to the movies, and meals out with Jean's boss, Anthony Miller. Katie, blissfully unaware of anything unusual, spoke cheerfully about the outings. Dean, however, seemed to catch my reaction and quickly clarified. It was always with his daughter, Evelyn, Dad, he said. She kept saying Mom's such a big part of the company, and that we're all like one big happy family. Katie nodded in agreement. Yeah, Aunt Evelyn always came with us, she added brightly. I smiled at them, masking my unease. I'm glad you had fun while I was gone, I said. Now that I'm back and summer's coming, we'll go on vacation and have the best time ever. Their cheers and excited hugs lifted my spirits momentarily. After dropping them off at school, I began making calls, friends, former colleagues, and eventually George Tallis, my old mentor. George had been a guiding force in my early career, teaching me invaluable lessons about the markets. It's all driven by greed and fear, he would say. He was still in Chicago, running a small firm for a select group of long-term clients. As we talked, we reviewed my qualifications, my SEC registration, FINRA membership, state securities licensure, and compliance with anti-money laundering protocols. I promised to send him the SCAA prospectus, and we agreed to discuss potential opportunities later. On my way to my first meeting, I stopped by HSHS Community Pharmacy to pick up melatonin and vitamins. As I was leaving, I spotted Jean's boss, Anthony Miller, and his daughter Evelyn emerging from St. John's Hospital. They walked together, their heads bowed, shoulders slumped, and an air of shared sadness between them. I stood quietly, watching as they got into a waiting Uber. Something about their demeanor nagged at me. They looked connected in a way that went beyond professional camaraderie or casual friendship. Was it grief? A romance? Or something else entirely? The events of the previous night replayed in my mind, but nothing added up. Was Jean unwell and keeping it from me? Or was Evelyn the one in trouble? They hadn't seemed physically ill, but their bond was undeniable. It wasn't a simple matter of affection. It was deeper, more complex. I couldn't ignore the questions swirling in my head. Whatever was going on, I had to figure it out. But as much as my mind raced with possibilities, none of them felt like the answer. Now what? I tried to gather my thoughts and focus as best I could under the circumstances. I attended my meetings, presenting the CAA opportunity with full transparency, including the fact that my position at work was precarious and I might lose my job. My first meeting was with Julian Knowles, who listened carefully and promised to discuss the proposal with his investment group before making a decision. The second meeting was with Aaron Goldstein, a seasoned retailer with deep pockets. He was immediately intrigued by the idea and, after some time reallocating funds on his laptop, agreed to transfer $10 million to my trading account as soon as the paperwork was finalized. Later, while sipping coffee at a Starbucks on Monroe, George called. He liked the proposal and mentioned that a group of his clients might be interested. We agreed on a commission structure. Higher returns would mean a higher percentage for me. Next, I called my dad to share the CAA opportunity. He was interested and said he'd invest $100,000, promising to transfer the funds the next day. When I shared the broader details of my situation, there was a pause on the line. I could almost see him carefully processing the information. My dad, ever thoughtful and deliberate, had spent years as a risk analyst for a major insurance company. When he finally spoke, his tone was serious. "Her behavior sounds like someone who's lost someone close," he said. "But it's not her parents. They're both alive and well, living happily in Arizona. She has no siblings, and her cousins are distant at best." We talked for a while longer, exploring his thoughts, and in the end, I had to admit he might be onto something. Before we ended the call, he offered to send me the contact information for a private investigator his firm had frequently used for insurance cases. Once home, I reached out to my contacts in Singapore and Southeast Asia to get a clearer picture of the local market. My updated risk assessment for CAA largely aligned with my initial analysis. The numbers were solid, the management team remained strong, and the project's early-stage challenges seemed manageable. Most importantly, the leadership had invested their own money, signaling confidence in the venture's long-term success. This gave me renewed assurance. With everything prepared, I just needed to wait for the markets to open to start trading. In the meantime, I called the private investigator, Clarence Williams. His LinkedIn profile and the modest website for his company, Discreet Solutions, provided little personal detail. No photos, no fluff. When we spoke, his slow southern drawl contrasted with the sharp, probing questions he asked, revealing a keen and perceptive mind. He requested a $5,000 advance, explaining that he could start immediately because my dad had been a reliable client. With those arrangements made, I spent the rest of the day trying to calm my growing anxiety. Dean and Katie arrived home late after practice, and I spent as much time with them as possible, explaining that I had an important deal to focus on that evening. Jean came in looking more composed than the night before, but still tired. "I picked up Chinese food on the way home," she said, stepping into my study and giving me a brief kiss on the cheek. "Are you working?" "Hi, Jean," I replied evenly, deliberately avoiding any affectionate language. "I want us to eat dinner together as a family, but I'll need to get back to work by 7. "Okay, that's fine, I guess," she said hesitantly, her tone uncertain. She handed me a small wrap box. "Here's your birthday present." The card read, "Happy birthday, Adam. Lots of love, Jean." It felt impersonal, more like a formality than a heartfelt gesture. Inside the package was a bottle of Hugo Boss aftershave. "Thank you," I said, trying to sound sincere. She leaned in for a quick kiss on the lips, but it felt distant, almost obligatory, like she was a relative rather than my wife. We had dinner as a family. Dean and Katie animatedly shared stories about their day, their energy a welcome distraction. Jean, however, was quieter, contributing little to the conversation. When Dean mentioned the skateboard park's closure and the lack of activities for kids in town, Katie brought up a project her mom's boss was working on. "It's good that Mr. Miller is turning a property into a shelter for troubled teens," Katie said innocently. I glanced at Jean, raising an eyebrow. She shifted uncomfortably. Yes, well, I might have mentioned it, she admitted. Tony wants to create something lasting, and this is his way of giving back. Her explanation was brief and lacked conviction. It was clear she was holding back more than she was willing to share. I'm surprised. I didn't know Miller was involved in something like that, I said, genuinely taken aback. I had always thought of him as more of a socialite, someone who preferred clubs and high-profile networking. Jean replied with a mix of pride, or perhaps something else I couldn't quite place. His wife Lynn started the project before she passed away. He's been keeping it going ever since. He often uses his empty properties for these shelters, but now he wants to create a permanent one. Why? I asked, my tone curious but measured. Why not? She retorted, her voice sharp enough to catch me off guard. It's a great cause and it's really needed. The city and state aren't doing much to help. She paused abruptly, glancing at the kids, as if stopping herself from saying too much in front of them. I gestured toward the door, silently telling Dean and Katie to excuse themselves. They left the table obediently, and I turned back to Jean. Why now? That's what I meant, I clarified, watching her closely. There was something in her expression, a flicker of something she was trying to hide. Her demeanor shifted slightly, and her eyes seemed distant for a moment. The moment has come, she said, nodding as though emphasizing the importance of her words. Okay, I said, smiling faintly. That sounds good. Springfield could definitely use something like that. She smiled back, and we stood to clean up the remnants of our meal. I worked to maintain a cheerful appearance, but inside, I felt an unsettling unease. Jean's words felt rehearsed, her tone too guarded. There was truth in what she was saying, but I could sense it wasn't the whole truth. Her body language gave her away. She was holding something back. We cleared the table together, and I helped take out the trash. Afterward, I told her I needed to head to my study to work. With an hour to go before the Singapore market opened, I sat down to think. My mind swirled with doubts and questions about our marriage. I fought to stay calm, knowing that letting my emotions take over now would cloud my judgment. But suppressing my feelings came with its own risks. I worried that bottling everything up would only make things worse later. As I reflected, I realized just how far we had drifted. In the early days, Jean and I had been in sync, agreeing on everything from where to live to how many kids to have. We shared a strong bond and a solid relationship. The last few years, though, had been more challenging. My job required frequent travel, and while we had always planned for my returns and savored those moments, this time felt different. I had assumed we were still on the same page, but now I wasn't so sure. Frustration bubbled up as I thought about the sacrifices I'd made. In Southeast Asia, I had plenty of opportunities to stray. Women approached me regularly, at work, on the subway, at markets, and especially in bars. Many of my colleagues dated locals, some even moving them into their homes. But I had always said no. I was married, and more than that, I loved my wife. I had believed she loved me too, but her recent actions had shaken that belief. I tried to think back, searching for signs I might have missed. Other than our increasingly infrequent communication, nothing stood out. Still, I had to push those thoughts aside for now. The market was about to open, and I needed to focus. When trading began, CAA stocks were at $8.49, far below their launch price. I approached the situation cautiously. The market was full of nervous sellers and only a handful of buyers. With over $30 million in funds from my contacts and George's network, I began buying. My first purchase was for $5 million from a seller whose identity was unclear. Almost immediately, the market was flooded with shares as panicked investors rushed to sell. I suspected my former team was behind it, acting under pressure from corporate leaders. I continued buying in $5 million increments, trying to stabilize the price, but it kept dropping. It became clear that someone was short selling on a massive scale, profiting from the falling stock. The price plunged further, hitting $5.61 before I made my final purchase, a $15 million block. As the market settled, I leaned back in my chair, exhausted but determined. The stakes were higher than ever, and I had no choice but to see this through. In total, the $30 million we invested secured us just over 10% of the available shares. This significant stake meant we could appoint someone to the board if we decided to hold on to the shares rather than selling for a profit. Feeling a mix of relief and cautious optimism, I called George to celebrate. Over the phone, we shared a drink. I chose J.P. Weiser's 18-year-old Canadian whiskey on the rocks, while George, ever the traditionalist, poured himself a 10-year-old Blue Light bourbon. The market reacted to our purchases. Investors who had been hesitating began to step in, buying shares at what was now seen as an undervalued price. By the time I logged off for the night, the stock had climbed to $8.72. Those who had bet against it were likely feeling the pressure. Glancing at the clock, I realized it was nearly 2 a.m. exhausted. I tidied up quickly and slipped into bed, forgetting the melatonin tablets I'd left in the car. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. Downstairs, Dean and Katie were finishing breakfast while Jean was on the phone. I overheard her mention that time was important, though the context was unclear. When she saw me, she ended the call. "Work," she said with an exaggerated shrug as she poured me a cup of coffee. "You must have come in late," she added. I nodded, sipping the coffee she handed me. "Did your trading go well?" I shrugged nonchalantly. "It's still early. We'll just have to wait and see." "Okay," she replied, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek. "You look tired. I'll take the kids to school." With that, she called for Dean and Katie. They shouted their goodbyes and "Love you, Dad," as they left. I poured myself another cup of coffee and headed to my study. Checking the closing price of the shares, I was pleased to see they had ended the day at $10.14, a solid rebound. Investors holding shares would be pleased, while those who had shorted the stock would be facing steep losses. It seemed the market was beginning to stabilize, free from the manipulation it had been subjected to. I washed my hands and got to work, sending emails and making calls. My first priority was updating our investment group. Once that was done, curiosity led me to the Miller Real Estate website. The site was standard fare, featuring the usual mission and vision statements, along with glowing testimonials from clients. A section highlighted their community outreach program, particularly the New Horizons Home for Troubled Teens. The initiative claimed to provide housing, meals, training, and counseling to help at-risk youth finish school, find jobs, and avoid trouble. Finding little else of interest there, I turned to Facebook. Anthony Miller's profile showcased a life of luxury, photos of his cars, vacations, and social gatherings. Among the recent posts was a group photo from a company event. The image featured the entire MRE team, with Anthony at the center, Evelyn on one side, and Jean on the other. Two details caught my attention. Anthony appeared significantly thinner and older than I remembered. Additionally, Jean was holding his arm, gazing at him rather than the camera. It could have meant anything or nothing, but it was enough to spark questions. Jean's own Facebook page offered little insight. It was sparsely updated, mostly featuring old family photos and work-related posts. The last photo of us together was over 2 years old, a stark reminder of how distant we had grown. Evelyn's profile, however, painted a different picture. It contained numerous photos of her with Jean over the years, some of which also included Anthony. While nothing overtly suspicious stood out, their consistent proximity seemed unusual. Her most recent posts were cryptic, reflecting on life's meaning and expressing vague hopes for better days. Later, I checked in with Clarence Williams. He told me to call him Clarence, saying he felt like he already knew me from his long history with my dad. I expressed my desire to expedite the investigation, but he cautioned that these things couldn't be rushed. After that, I called my dad. His advice was simple but firm. Stop jumping to conclusions. Let the professionals do their job. It was sound advice, but patience wasn't coming easily. With so many unanswered questions hanging in the air, I couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away, and with it, the chance to piece everything together. He told me to give it time, but that was easier said than done. I was caught in a web of confusion. Should I reach out to Jean and try to repair what was broken? What if I did, only to discover I'd been deceived? Yet if I did nothing and missed a chance to save our marriage, how much would it hurt to know I could have made a difference but didn't? In my uncertainty, I decided to call a well-known lawyer's office in town. A female associate answered and offered some straightforward advice. She suggested that I should try to fix the marriage rather than rush into a divorce. There are rarely any winners in a divorce, she said. Mostly there are just losers. Her words stayed with me as I weighed my options. I had one more avenue to explore. A former colleague of Gene's owed me a favor after I'd helped him with some stock recommendations. Chad had worked at MRE 6 or 7 months ago before moving to a competing real estate company. Hoping he could provide insight, I arranged to meet him for a late lunch at Red Robin. Chad arrived looking the part of a typical realtor. Company golf shirt, khakis, and sunglasses perched on his head. After some small talk over burgers, I cut to the chase. "So, you're trying to dig for information, Adam?" he asked, smirking as he realized my intentions. I nodded. "Why?" "I'm just trying to understand MRE a little better. Some things have come up that worry me," I replied, keeping my explanation vague. Chad's expression turned serious. "Things changed a lot after Tony lost his wife, to cancer. He was really out of it for a while. Then his daughter became his main focus. About a year later, he seemed to find his footing again. He hesitated, studying me carefully. Your wife and Tony became pretty close during that time. People at the office sometimes called her his office wife. I felt a lump form in my throat, making it hard to speak. I gestured for him to continue. "I never saw anything inappropriate myself," he added quickly, "but you know how office gossip works. People talk." He paused, scratching his head. "One thing I can say is that Tony, Evelyn, and your wife spent a lot of time together, especially since you travel so much. Right?" I shrugged, feeling an overwhelming sense of helplessness. We danced around the topic, avoiding specifics. Just as Chad was about to leave, something seemed to occur to him. "You know, there are rumors that Anthony might have cancer. Have you heard that?" The words hung in the air. We said our goodbyes, but I stayed behind, mulling over what he'd said. On impulse, I called St. John's Hospital and inquired about Anthony Miller. I learned he was in a private room in the oncology ward. Paying for lunch, I headed home, my mind racing. That evening mirrored the past 2 nights. After tidying up, I poured myself a drink and stepped outside to unwind. The neighborhood was calm, but my thoughts were anything but. A few minutes later, Jean joined me with a glass of wine in hand. "Can we talk, Adam?" she asked, her voice measured. "Sure," I said cautiously. "You went to the MRE website," she stated, her tone suspicious. She sounded as though she already knew more than I'd anticipated. "And?" I replied evenly. "I want to know why," she said. "Why are you looking at the company website? What do you expect to find? Did you check everyone's social media too?" Her gaze was sharp, almost daring me to give her a reason to escalate the conversation. After years of marriage, I recognized the signs. "What did you think you would find?" she pressed. "Exactly what I found," I said, keeping my expression neutral. "And what was that?" She shot back, her tone edging toward frustration. "Why are you questioning me, Jean?" I asked, deflecting. "I'm not questioning you," she replied, though her tone said otherwise. "It feels like you're being sneaky. Social media isn't exactly private," I said, chuckling lightly, though I knew it wouldn't help. Her expression darkened. "Evelyn said you looked at her Instagram," she accused. "Did she?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "Yes, she did," Jean replied, her voice tense as she paused, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "Why are you acting like this?" "Like what?" I countered, blowing out a puff of smoke deliberately. "Like this." "Right now," she said, her frustration building. "Why do you think, Adam?" I stared at her without emotion, the smoke curling between us. She waved her hand in irritation, trying to clear the air, but in the process spilled some wine onto her blouse. "Please stop, Adam," she said, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. Normally, I would have comforted her, but tonight everything was different. "Why are you crying, Jean?" I asked, my tone flat. "You're upsetting me with your attitude," she said, her voice rising in an attempt to assert herself. I responded by blowing another cloud of smoke, letting it linger in the space between us. "Who are you?" I asked, the question cutting through the tension. She faltered, her composure slipping as she struggled to answer. After a moment, she finally spoke. "I'm your wife, Adam Carter." "That's who I am," she said, glaring at me with defiance. "I'm not so sure," I replied, turning and walking away as she gasped audibly. I heard her retreat hurriedly into the house. I finished my drink, stubbed out my cigarette, and headed to my study. The market was moving, and CAA stock had reached $11.92. George and I had a call, and we agreed that the trend wasn't just a temporary uptick. The stock was stabilizing, and its momentum felt solid. I stayed online, monitoring the market. Blue-chip stocks were climbing steadily, while most others showed the usual fluctuations. CAA was the outlier, surging in value but still far from its original price. Some investors were starting to cash in, taking profits after buying at rock-bottom prices. I messaged a former colleague at JP Morgan, who shared some updates. They'd managed to sell about half their holdings at roughly 50 cents on the dollar. But Joe Rutledge had advised holding onto the rest, sensing the market was turning in their favor. We laughed at the irony. My replacement might now have to advocate for the very stock I'd fought for. That night, I didn't return to the bedroom. Instead, I pulled out the sofa bed in my study, grabbed a spare blanket, and slept there. The next morning, I woke early to check the Singapore market. CAA had closed at $13 and some change, another significant jump. The trend was meeting expectations, and our group's investment had doubled. If the stock hit our projected target of $25, the profit would exceed 300%. I made breakfast, called the kids to eat, and sipped my coffee. I avoided Jean, saying little to her as I focused on the day ahead. After dropping the kids at school, I went to the gym, then stopped by IHOP for a late breakfast. I made a few calls and returned home for a 2-hour meeting with George over Teams. During our meeting, we discussed establishing a combined brokerage with offices in Springfield and Chicago. George would handle the business structure while I worked on a market entry plan. We brainstormed strategies, and I spent the afternoon refining my approach. Later, I heard Jean come home. She was alone. "I've dropped Katie and Dean at the Beckers for the night," she said. "We need to talk." She led me to the living room and poured drinks for both of us. Whiskey for me, wine for herself. I sat down, waiting for her to start. Silence hung between us, and I knew she was waiting for me to speak first. I stayed quiet, sipping my drink, until she broke. "I don't know what you think I've been doing while you were away, Adam," she began, her voice tinged with exasperation. "I haven't thought about it," I replied curtly. "Well, you're treating me very poorly," she said, her tone sharper now. "Is that how you feel? Poorly treated?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She nodded, but then faltered, realizing her contradiction. Tears began to fall as she spoke again. "I'm sorry, Adam. You're never home anymore. We feel like strangers." She wiped her tears, a hint of satisfaction flickering across her face, as though she felt she'd made her point. "So, after 17 years, we're strangers because I was away for 4 months?" I asked, my tone laced with disbelief. "All the video calls, messages, and phone calls meant nothing?" "I've been under a lot of stress," she said, wiping her eyes again. "But you're my husband, and I'm your wife, and that's what matters." Her voice held defiance as she met my gaze. Then, without waiting for a response, she got up and left the room. I sat there, sipping my drink, wondering if she was being unreasonable or if I was missing something vital. Moments later, I heard her phone ring. Her voice was quiet, the words unintelligible, but her tone suggested the conversation was serious. Soon after, I heard the sound of running water. It took her a while to come back downstairs. She wore a soft gray dress that fell just above the knee, paired with black shoes and the single strand of pearls I'd given her years ago. For a 39-year-old mother of 2, she looked stunning, better than many women a decade younger. "Go take a shower and get ready," she said. "I'll make a reservation at Chesapeake Seafood Restaurant." I was ready in 15 minutes. As I got dressed, I noticed her on the phone again, but I decided not to bring it up. For now, it was better to stay quiet. We took an Uber to the restaurant, where Jean began the evening with a gin and tonic, her latest discovery. To impress her, I ordered a Singapore sling. Once seated, she chose a mussel hot pot, while I opted for half a dozen oysters to start. Over a bottle of Chardonnay, we talked about the kids. Jean didn't seem particularly concerned about my job loss. "You're one of the smartest men I know, Adam," she said with a reassuring smile. "I know you'll find a new job soon." She didn't realize, or perhaps chose not to acknowledge, how adrift I felt. I forced a smile as she added, "We have savings to get us by until then." Her optimism was almost amusing, if not a little concerning. She had no idea that everything, including our savings, was riding on my unwavering belief in CAA. But I let it go, focusing on the better parts of the evening. As we moved through the meal, the conversation turned to lighter topics: friends, family, and the mundane aspects of everyday life that sustain any marriage. She asked about some of my former colleagues from work events, steering clear of anything related to MRE. I, in turn, avoided bringing it up until I had more concrete information. For the main course, I ordered the captain's platter while Jean chose the lobster. She kept refilling my wine glass, and I began to suspect she wanted me to drink more than usual. If that was her plan, it was working. The evening grew warmer as we reconnected. If Jean was seeing someone else, she was doing an exceptional job of showing how much she cared about me. She held my hand, met my eyes, and gave me her undivided attention. After dinner, instead of heading home, she suggested we visit the gin mill for their renowned artisanal gins. The cocktail bar was bustling, but we managed to find a spot after weaving through the crowd. After some effort, we caught the bartender's attention and ordered Negronis. Pressed together in the crowd, Jean wrapped her arm around my waist, grounding me with her touch. She leaned in for a quick kiss, her smile lighting up her face. The lively atmosphere faded into the background, and for a moment, it felt like it was just the two of us. We exchanged soft glances and whispered playful remarks, her laughter warm and unguarded. It felt like the connection we'd been missing for so long had returned, pulling us closer. When we decided to leave, I paid the bill, leaving a generous tip for the attentive bartender. Jean took my hand eagerly, and we stepped outside to hail a taxi. During the ride home, the city lights blurred past the windows. Jean rested her head on my shoulder, her fingers lightly tracing patterns on my hand. We shared quiet kisses, lost in the comfort of each other's presence. It felt as though the rest of the world had disappeared, leaving only the warmth between us. Once home, the soft glow of the living room lamps greeted us. Jean tossed her purse onto the couch and sank into it with a laugh, pulling me down beside her. "Come here, big guy," she said with a playful grin, waving me over. I couldn't help but smile as I leaned in for a kiss. It was deep and electric, a spark reigniting between us. Wrapping my arms around her, I traced gentle circles on her back. She laughed softly, leaning into the moment. The warmth between us grew as we let the evening unfold naturally, guided by the quiet intimacy that had always been the foundation of our relationship. Every touch, glance, and whisper seemed to melt away the tension, leaving only the connection we both craved. Later, as we lay side by side, our breathing slowed. I brushed a strand of hair from her face, and she smiled, her eyes reflecting trust and contentment. We shared soft conversations, laughing at little jokes and savoring the simple joy of being together. In that moment, the weight of the past weeks seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet hope for the future. Eventually, I got up and helped her to the shower. We took turns under the warm water, washing away the day's stress and finding small moments of peace. She smiled softly at me as I handed her a towel, and we both felt calm and relaxed afterward. Back in bed, she curled up beside me, her head resting on my chest. The rhythm of her breathing gradually lulled me into sleep. The next morning, the smell of coffee and breakfast pulled me from sleep. I dressed in comfortable clothes and went downstairs, where I found her in the kitchen, flipping bacon. "Good morning," she said cheerfully, walking over to give me a quick kiss on the cheek. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "You're really treating me well," I said with a small laugh. "Just getting you ready for the day," she replied, her tone light. "There's a lot to do today." We sat down to breakfast together, chatting about small things and planning our day. She mentioned picking up Dean and Katie later while I planned to tackle some chores in the backyard. It felt like a simple, pleasant morning. As I worked in the yard, humming along to the music playing in the background. My phone buzzed on the patio table. Picking it up, I glanced at the caller ID, and my mood shifted. "Hello," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk," said Clarence Williams, his tone serious. In that moment, I knew things were about to change. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, and I quickly tidied up and left the yard unfinished. Clarence was waiting when I arrived, waving me over to his table. He wasn't what I had expected, short and slight, with thinning gray hair and plain clothes that made him look unassuming. His appearance seemed carefully crafted to be forgettable, but his firm handshake and sharp eyes told a different story. "Let's not waste time, Mr. Carter," he began, his voice direct. "We haven't seen your wife go to hotels or secret meetings." He raised a hand, cutting off my attempt to interrupt. "However, we've gathered enough evidence to suggest she has been involved with her boss, Anthony Miller, for at least 2 years. This relationship is no secret at the office," he continued, his words cutting through me like a knife. "Miller's daughter, Evelyn, knows about it and seems to support it. During the week, they often spent time together, and when you were away, she arranged for the kids to stay with friends so she could spend weekends at his house." I felt my hands gripping the edge of the table as my heart raced. Suspecting an affair was one thing, but hearing it confirmed was a different pain altogether. Every instinct screamed at me to lash out, but I knew I couldn't. Anger wouldn't solve anything, and society didn't condone the kind of response I felt brewing inside me. Clarence kept talking, though I struggled to process his words. "Mr. Miller has a very serious form of pancreatic cancer," he said, his voice steady. "He only has a few months left to live." "What?" I asked, barely able to form the word. "Miller's cancer has metastasized. He's undergoing treatment again, but it doesn't seem to be helping." The pieces fell into place. Chad's comments, the hospital information, it all made sense now. Jean's recent behavior was the result of her grief. She was already mourning a man she loved, struggling to come to terms with the inevitable. I opened up to Clarence, not because I trusted him entirely, but because I needed someone to talk to in that moment. Clarence listened carefully before speaking again. "Many people who cheat try to downplay it," he said, his tone thoughtful. "They'll say it's just physical or doesn't mean anything. But that's rarely true. There's usually an emotional connection, and for most people, the feelings come first. No one engages in something like this purely for physical reasons." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between us. I could see there was more depth to him than I had initially thought, and his insight gave me a new perspective. Despite the turmoil within me, I knew I had to keep calm. The choices I made now would define what happened next. "It might begin that way," Clarence continued, "but soon, emotions like love come into play. They convince themselves it's acceptable because they believe they can love more than one person at the same time." He paused, watching me closely to ensure I understood. Cheating isn't just about spending time alone together. They go to restaurants, see movies, take walks, and share experiences. They talk about books, politics, dreams, and ideas. They create a bond, one similar to what married couples share. He nodded slightly, as though agreeing with his own analysis. They share their hopes and frustrations, all the while feeling resentment that their secret relationship isn't their everyday life. Often, they begin blaming their spouse. They criticize their partner as a way to feel better about themselves and justify their actions. Then they share these complaints with each other, using them as an excuse for what they're doing. I sat there, stunned and heartbroken. The picture he painted was clear, and I understood everything now. But, in truth, it would have hurt less to think their relationship was purely physical. Instead, my wife had built a life with another man, one where she shared the joys and connections we once had, without the challenges of raising children, managing finances, or navigating the mundane routines of marriage. She had given all her attention to him, focusing on the enjoyable moments he could provide, free from the weight of daily responsibilities. Their relationship existed in a bubble, untouched by the dull or difficult parts of life that come with a long-term partnership. After discussing things further, Clarence and I agreed to pause the investigation for now, giving me time to decide my next steps. Once he left, I sat alone, staring at the remnants of my life as I'd known it. One thing was clear: my marriage was over. The notion of staying together for the children no longer felt like an option. While I hated the thought of being apart from Dean and Katie, I also understood that many children in the U.S. grew up in separated or divorced families. My kids, it seemed, would be no different. I took a sip of my cold coffee, the bitterness matching the ache in my chest. The pain was sharp and real, and I knew it would hurt Jean and Miller too. But I couldn't let myself be consumed by anger. Emotions, unchecked, would only cloud my judgment. I thought back to the business leaders I had met in the Far East. They approached both life and work with a long-term perspective, and when conflicts arose between families or groups, resolution often didn't come until one side was utterly defeated. But I wasn't part of a powerful faction or some old-world family. I was just a regular man, living a normal life. I had no secret resources, no powerful allies, and no safety net to rely on. The only certainty was that I was facing this alone. I ordered another coffee and sat in thought, piecing together how I might confront the people who had caused this pain. Jean seemed straightforward enough to deal with. I would take away the things she loved most, whatever they were. That was her treasure, and I could already feel a plan forming. But Miller was different. He wasn't bound to me by any promises. Jean was the one who had broken our vows. Still, Miller had pursued her, knowing she was married, disrespecting me, our children, and our family. There had to be consequences. My emotions churned as I considered my options. Anger, driven by a deep hurt, fueled me. I thought about my early evaluations at work. Two traits had always stood out. First, I was a risk taker, willing to go all in even when caution might have been wiser. Second, I was stubborn, unwilling to back down from a decision once it was made, no matter the cost. These traits now drove my desire for revenge, pushing me to consider consequences I might not fully comprehend. An idea began to take shape. I called Clarence and instructed him to gather information about the women Miller and Evelyn had helped through their New Horizons program. It wasn't a fully developed plan, just the first step in a quest for knowledge, a thread to pull that might unravel everything. I was hoping to uncover something valuable. Back in 2014, during a 3-week stint at our Kenya branch, I joined the local team one weekend for a deep-sea fishing trip in the Indian Ocean. That experience had taught me a few lessons. When fishing for marlin, you first catch smaller fish like bonito. These smaller fish are reeled in, hooked to marlin lines, and used as bait to attract the larger prize. I'd succeeded in catching a marlin that day, but I also felt a pang of sadness as I watched the magnificent creature fight for its life. I'd promised myself that it would be my only time engaging in big game fishing. Yet, as I thought about my current situation, those lessons about bait and patience came back to me. On the drive home, I practiced breathing exercises until I felt calm enough to slip back into the role I was playing. When I arrived, Jean wasn't home yet, so I spent the time catching up on neglected chores. Later, she returned with Dean and Katie, and we made a hearty dinner together. Steaks, corn on the cob, coleslaw, and warm baguettes. That evening, I fully immersed myself in the part of the engaged father and caring husband. I hugged and kissed my family, paying attention to every detail of their needs and joys. Outwardly, I was warm and attentive. Inwardly, I was calculating and cynical, realizing how easy it was to manipulate others by acting as though you care, speaking sweet words, and meeting their eyes with sincerity. Jean seemed to enjoy the attention, and I couldn't help but think that, with her partner nearing the end of his life, I was becoming her backup plan. However, my moments with Dean and Katie felt genuine and grounding. Even if my interactions with Jean felt rehearsed, I could sense she was emotionally invested in our exchanges. Cynical Adam told me to keep this in mind when I eventually navigated life after divorce and met new women. The following days passed in an odd duality. I was living a fabricated life while observing myself in the role I'd chosen. It made me wonder if actors felt the same when watching themselves on screen. On a brighter note, the business George and I had set up in Singapore was thriving. We'd moved our SEA stock portfolio there, and the results were promising. After a shaky start, SEA shares were now trading at $16.33 and rising steadily. Our initial investment had more than doubled, and I began to hope for a threefold return. The ease with which I had adopted a new persona began to unsettle me. To regain control, I enhanced my digital security. I implemented a system requiring both a fingerprint and a password, encrypted all my files and emails, and turned off my laptop daily. Any email not from George was deleted unopened. I backed up important data to the cloud and wiped my phone clean before reinstalling only the essentials. With those measures in place, I returned to searching for promising shares and contacting potential investors from my JP Morgan network to prepare for a business pitch. The non-compete agreement from my previous job no longer concerned me. Being fired had significantly weakened its enforceability. At home, things remained quiet while I waited for Clarence's next update. Finally, on Thursday, he handed me a thumb drive at a different coffee shop, chosen to ease my growing anxieties about being watched. The drive contained information on 14 women Miller and his daughter had assisted through their program. Clarence had compiled brief bios and a few old photos. 5 of the women lived nearby, and one had become a full-time escort. I obtained her number and bought a burner phone to contact her. We arranged to meet at a motel on the city's outskirts. She told me her rate was $100 an hour, and I'd need to cover the cost of the room as well. At 2 p.m., she arrived right on time. She was petite, thin, and covered in tattoos. "Show me the money," she said immediately, standing in the doorway. I pulled out $200 from my pocket, placed it on the bed, and gestured for her to come closer. "$200 will cover everything," she said, "but there are some rules. Safety first, and let's keep things clean." She began rummaging through her bag. I raised my hand to stop her. "How would you like to earn $1,000? I asked. Her demeanor changed instantly. She grabbed her bag and stood up. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "I don't do anything shady, mister," Layla said firmly. "No shady business," I assured her. "I just need some information." She hesitated. "What kind of information?" "I want to know about the shelter for women you stayed at a few years ago." She seemed uncertain, but after some coaxing, she began to share her story. The short version was devastatingly familiar. She had left home immediately after finishing school because she couldn't stand her stepfather. Homeless and vulnerable, she eventually resorted to desperate measures just to survive. Stealing food, trading favors for shelter, and later turning to drugs. Her life spiraled further when she started working the streets for money. One night, a man became violent when she refused his demands, leaving her battered and discarded like garbage. Local bystanders found her and called for help. The police took her to the hospital, and it was then that Mrs. Miller reached out, offering her a place at the shelter. Layla stayed there for nearly 6 months, but the rigid rules became too much for her, and she decided to leave. As she finished her story, the room fell silent. Her experience was tragic, but sadly not unique. For a moment, I wondered if what I was about to do would make me a worse person than I already felt. But my thirst for revenge drowned out those doubts. "So," I asked, "when you lived there, did the bad treatment start right away? Or did it happen later?" Layla blinked, thinking. She began shaking her head, but suddenly stopped. I could see the gears turning in her mind. "How much?" she asked, her voice sharper now. "I'm thinking $5,000, I said, aiming to start low. "Why so little?" she countered, her negotiation skills sharper than I'd anticipated. I paused, calculating. She might not have a formal education, but she knew how to bargain. "Miller hurt my family, and I want to hurt him back," I explained, watching her closely. Would she choose the money or let her morals prevail? $20,000, she said, smiling cautiously, testing my resolve. I hesitated, weighing her credibility. She caught my hesitation and smirked. "What?" she asked. "Worried about spending that much on someone like me?" Her confidence was unnerving. Leaning in, she added, "Make it $25,000, and I'll show you how the Me Too movement really works." We talked logistics, carefully outlining how the money would be transferred. Layla explained that she wanted to start fresh, especially for her young daughter. She hoped to leave her old life behind. I made her a genuine offer. If things worked out, I'd help her find a job in Chicago. Her eyes lit up with hope. "For real?" she asked, excitement and fear mingling in her voice. "For real," I said firmly. Are you just saying that to get what you want? She looked like a child reaching for a treat, wary it might be snatched away. I reassured her that my offer was sincere. She agreed to fulfill her part and promised to reach out when ready to proceed. We exchanged numbers, and I asked her to save mine under Jerry on her phone. So, she said, "You've paid for my time. Want to make use of it?" I politely declined, leaving phase 1 complete. At home, I felt a growing conflict within myself. Jean didn't seem to notice. She was preoccupied with Miller's project, pouring all her energy into its grand opening. I stayed in the background, blending in as much as possible while gathering details about how far the project had progressed. We cooked meals together and spent time as a family, but my emotions were a tangled mess. With Dean and Katie, my feelings were genuine. With Jean, everything felt calculated, like a performance. Despite my reservations, Jean seemed to see our time together as an improvement. Her behavior surprised me. Rather than retreating, she leaned into our renewed connection. By the end of the week, she was initiating moments of closeness, small gestures, lingering touches, and affectionate words. On Friday morning over breakfast, she casually mentioned her plans for the day. "I'll be busy helping with the grand opening of the New Horizons home," she said, her tone filled with purpose. I nodded, hiding my inner turmoil. Everything about this situation was closing in, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I had to act. She was deeply committed to the project, and it was clear how much it meant to her. The grand opening was scheduled for Monday morning, with the mayor and local media expected to attend. I feigned casual interest, asking her questions about the event while keeping my true intentions hidden. Jean grew emotional as she spoke about Tony, particularly her efforts to ensure he could attend despite his deteriorating health. It was clear she cared about both the project and the man behind it. Meanwhile, I continued to quietly prepare my next steps. The divorce papers were ready, waiting for me to decide the right moment to move forward. Illinois' no-fault divorce laws would make the legal process straightforward, even if the emotional toll was anything but. That morning, I checked our stocks and was pleased to see a steady rise, a promising start to the day. As I enjoyed my coffee, I tuned into a local radio station where Evelyn Miller, one of the driving forces behind New Horizons, was being interviewed. Evelyn spoke with passion, emphasizing the shelter's mission and its connection to her family's legacy. The project was presented as a labor of love, and listeners seemed moved by her sincerity. Many called in to praise the initiative, with some even pledging donations live on air. Then, the tone of the program shifted. A nervous caller came on, her voice trembling as she issued a warning. "Don't trust the home or its background," she said, her words heavy with pain. Tony Miller took advantage of women who needed help. The studio went silent, the gravity of her accusation stunning everyone. The show cut to a break, and when it returned, the atmosphere was tense. The hosts, clearly caught off guard, struggled to reconcile Evelyn's earlier glowing endorsement of the home with these new, deeply unsettling claims. Evelyn was visibly shaken, but remained resolute. "That's nonsense," she insisted, her voice firm yet tinged with disbelief. "My father is a good man. He would never do anything like that." It was evident she genuinely believed her words. But as the calls continued, the conversation grew more chaotic. The phone lines lit up with a mix of outrage and support. Some callers defended Layla, the initial whistleblower, while others harshly criticized her motives. One caller sneered, "What can you expect?" implying she was only trying to profit from her story. Others questioned Evelyn directly, suggesting an investigation was warranted. The hosts, sensing the escalating tension, tried to moderate, but the story had already taken on a life of its own. Then, a calm yet resolute voice cut through the noise. "My name is Rita," the caller began, her voice quivering. "I'd prefer not to share my last name, but I've left my information with your producer." After a shaky breath, she dropped a bombshell. "Anthony Miller hurt me too." The lines erupted as more calls flooded in. Over on WTX, a competing station, listeners began discussing what was happening on WMA. Within minutes, callers started sharing their own stories. One caller, her voice barely audible, confessed, "I'm a married woman with children. I wanted to leave this in the past, but I was also hurt by Mr. Miller. Her voice broke as she continued. I was young and needed help, and he made me do things I didn't want to. I didn't know how to say no. Then, with an audible sob, she hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. When the host finally spoke, his voice wavered with emotion. I immediately called Vicky, an old friend who worked for a local newspaper and 2 regional radio stations. Have you been following what's happening on WMA and WTX? I asked. I have, she replied, her tone serious. I explained my concern, mentioning that Jean was involved with the New Horizons home project. Vicky promised to look into it, adding that if the accusations were true, it would be the largest scandal of its kind to hit Springfield in 2 generations. By lunchtime, the story had quieted on the airwaves, as if the presenters were afraid to address it further. But on social media, especially Twitter, the discussion exploded. Initially, opinions were split, with some defending Miller and others attacking him. Soon, however, the tide turned against him and anyone associated with him. Women began sharing their own experiences of mistreatment. Some accounts were detailed and harrowing, while others were brief acknowledgments of suffering. The sheer volume of stories made it nearly impossible to distinguish fact from fabrication. In just a few hours, the situation had spiraled into a storm of accusations, emotions, and uncertainty. The truth, whatever it was, now had to fight its way through the chaos. The story spread rapidly, not just across states but around the world. Overwhelmed, I turned off everything: my phone, the TV, the radio. The stress gave me a pounding headache, and I reached for some Tylenol. It was still early afternoon, with Dean and Katie at school. Feeling sweaty and uncomfortable from the emotions of the day, I stripped off my clothes and tossed them into the laundry before stepping into the shower. Warm water cascaded over me as I sat down, unable to hold back the tears. I cried harder than I had since losing my mom. That loss had felt like a deep, jagged wound, but this was different. This was worse. I crossed a line I couldn't uncross. The saying about fighting monsters and becoming one echoed in my mind. Anthony Miller had wronged me, but in my quest for revenge, I had unleashed a storm I could no longer control. All I could do now was brace myself for what was coming. When I picked up Dean and Katie later, I tried to refocus. Back at home, we cooked dinner together. Chicken stir-fry with noodles and a small salad on the side. We waited for Jean, but as the minutes ticked by, she didn't arrive. I tried calling her, but her phone was off. Eventually, we ate without her. I saved a plate of food in the microwave and put the salad in the fridge. Afterward, Dean, Katie, and I played a board game called Forbidden Island. The kids had fun, but I was distracted, glancing at the clock as the hours passed. By 10 p.m., the kids were in bed, and I sat alone in the living room when Jean finally walked through the door. She looked like someone whose world had just crumbled. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled, and her face pale. She sank into a chair, sighing deeply. "Have you heard?" she asked, her voice shaky. "Have you heard all the terrible things they're saying about Tony?" I handed her a large drink, which she gulped down quickly. "I have," I said calmly. "It seems like your boss is in trouble. Where there's smoke, there's usually fire." "No, Adam," she said firmly, shaking her head. "He's a good man. He'd never do anything like that." It was time to press further. "Jean," I said, watching her carefully, "you probably don't know him as well as you think." She looked up, confused, as I continued. "You and I don't keep secrets from each other. We're married. I know what you're capable of, and you know what I can do." Her expression shifted, a mix of hesitation and defensiveness. "You might see Miller as your boss, but who knows what he's really like underneath," I said, pushing gently but firmly. "No," she repeated, her voice breaking. "He's a good man. He wouldn't do anything like that." "I would know." "But how would you know, Jean?" I pressed. "He's your boss, someone you work with. He could be hiding things. I don't know him well, but I've always had a feeling about him. He's the type of man you wouldn't want alone with your family." She gasped at my words, visibly shaken. "Has he ever done anything inappropriate with you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Her face turned pale. "No, never. How can you even think that?" she said, shooting me a look that was meant to be angry, but came across as more hurt than anything. "It's just that you're an attractive woman, Jean," I said, softening my voice. "And if the things they're saying about him are true, then he isn't a good person." Tears welled in her eyes as she stared into her empty glass. She stood, muttered goodnight to Dean and Katie, and went upstairs to shower. I stayed in the living room, finishing my drink. When Jean finally came out of the bathroom, I pretended to be asleep. She went downstairs in her robe, and I quietly followed her to the staircase. She was on the phone, her voice low and strained. It was probably Evelyn. I heard her say the word nightmare several times, and then, but why? Why would more than one woman say she was harmed? This isn't going to go away easily. After a pause, she made another call. "Hi, Tony," I heard her say. I strained to catch her words as she moved into the kitchen, but only bits and pieces came through. She assured him it was a misunderstanding and that everything would be resolved. Her final words struck me like a blow. "I love you too." The microwave beeped, and I guess she was reheating her dinner. By the time she came to bed, I was already asleep. On Saturday, I woke early, made breakfast, and took Dean and Katie to their sports practices. My actions were calm and deliberate, but inside, I was unraveling. The storm I'd set in motion was growing, and I could only wait to see where it would strike next. As I pulled into the driveway, still on the phone with Vicky, the weight of the day hung over me. She told me another woman had come forward, making it 4 in total now. Her sources at the mayor's office said the entire New Horizons project was now deemed too risky, prompting city officials to distance themselves. Shortly after, community groups began cutting ties, and by mid-morning, the Attorney General's office had announced a full investigation into the allegations. When I arrived home, the house was quiet. Jean was gone, and the SGX was closed for the day, leaving me with little to do. I spoke with George about work and my dad about my crumbling marriage. My father agreed that the relationship seemed beyond repair, though he expressed concern for Dean and Katie. "They'll adapt," he said. "Kids do. It won't be easy, but they'll find a way to cope like millions of others." Deciding to reach out, I called Jean. "Where are you?" I asked. "Evelyn and I are with the company lawyers, trying to handle these awful claims," she replied, her voice strained. "Are you sure you should be involved in this?" I asked, letting my concern show. The fallout could be serious, and you don't want to get dragged into something damaging. As expected, she argued with me, insisting that her involvement was necessary. Still, I could tell the mounting legal battles weren't yielding much progress. By Saturday and Sunday, typically the busiest open house days for MRE, the company saw less than 20% of its usual visitor numbers. On Monday, the situation worsened. Calls poured in from clients canceling contracts and backing out of deals. That morning, the decision was made to delay the grand opening of the New Horizons home indefinitely. But the most significant blow came later that day. A prominent woman, married to a wealthy businessman and well-known in the area, took out a quarter-page ad in the local newspaper. In it, she claimed that during her brief stay at the New Horizons home, Anthony Miller had assaulted her twice. Her story was harrowing. She and her boyfriend had spiraled into homelessness after losing their jobs. He had gotten into trouble and disappeared, leaving her alone. Eventually, she was found begging for food behind a fast food restaurant, where the manager called the police. An officer directed her to the shelter, and though she stayed for only 8 days before reconnecting with her family, those 8 days, she alleged, had left lasting scars. Her ad included contact information for her lawyer, encouraging other women to join a class action lawsuit against Miller. By the end of the week, 5 significant developments had occurred. 1. Miller's health declined. Questioned by the district attorney while hospitalized, his condition deteriorated further. 2. Witnesses stepped forward. 3 of the 5 women who had come forward gave detailed statements to the police. Interestingly, all alleged incidents had occurred roughly 5 years ago. 3. MRE halted operations. The media frenzy forced MRE to temporarily close its doors. Jean shared nightly updates on Evelyn's desperate attempts to keep the company afloat as employees quit and clients fled. 4. CAA stock soared. The stock hit $24, and I began selling blocks gradually. Buyers eagerly snapped them up without lowering the price. We had recovered our initial investment and still retained 2/3 of the shares. Financially, I was in a secure position. 5. My divorce papers were delivered. After years of uncertainty, I was ready to move forward. That Friday evening, I returned home with a chilled bottle of 2012 vintage champagne, ready to celebrate my 5th year with Jean. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a BMW SUV with MRE stickers parked next to Jean's car. Inside, Jean and Evelyn were in the living room. Jean was crying while Evelyn comforted her. Ladies, I greeted them as I headed to the cabinet and pulled out 3 champagne glasses. They stared at me, confused, as I popped the cork and filled the glasses. "Cheers," I said, raising my glass and taking a long sip. Jean looked at me, her face pale. "You're divorcing me?" she exclaimed. "I thought we were a family." On the coffee table, an envelope containing the divorce papers lay in plain sight. Evelyn joined in, her voice sharp. "How could you, Adam? Don't you care about your wife? Don't you love her?" I set my empty glass down and reached for the bottle to refill it. "Drink up, Jean," I said, my tone flat. "We're celebrating the end of a chapter." The room fell silent as I continued. "First off, I could have cared, but I stopped when she got involved with your father." Jean's sobs grew louder, and Evelyn glared at me. But I felt no regret. The line had been crossed, and there was no turning back. This was the beginning of the end, and I was ready to see it through. I raised my glass toward Evelyn, my voice sharp. "Here's to your father's legacy. May he finally face the truth about who he really is." Her face went pale, and she seemed to shrink back into herself. "Drink up," I added with a mocking chuckle. "And let's not forget MRE. Here's to new beginnings." I drained my glass in one gulp and hurled it across the room, where it shattered against the wall. Jean cried out in alarm, and Evelyn flinched, curling her knees up as though preparing to confront me. Before she could act, I moved quickly, pressing her back into her seat with a single finger. "You come at me, and you'll regret it," I said, my tone cold and steady. Her eyes widened, the defiance in them replaced by fear. "Consider yourself lucky I'm not seeking revenge on you," I continued, turning my attention to Jean. "Get yourself a lawyer," I said, flashing her a sharp smile. "The kids will stay with my father until custody is settled." Jean stared at me, her face pale with shock. This side of me was unfamiliar to her, and she didn't know how to respond. "But I thought we were okay," she stammered, her voice trembling. I laughed, the sound bitter and hollow. "You thought everything we shared still meant something? Jean, I've treated you like someone I don't care about for months. Did you really not notice?" I poured another glass of champagne as they both remained frozen. Evelyn, visibly shaken, dropped her glass, spilling its contents onto the rug. Jean's glass was broken, and she was fussing over a cut on her finger. Their unease filled the room like static electricity. "So, I guess no more champagne for you too," I said, my tone dripping with sarcasm. Jean avoided my gaze, her voice breaking as she tried to defend herself. "I was just lonely," she murmured. "I needed some company." "I understand," I replied, my smile icy. "How's that working out for you now?" Before Jean could respond, Evelyn cut in. "And how many women were you with while you were gone?" she snapped, her voice trembling with anger. "Some men expect their partners to be perfect while they do whatever they please. Don't judge all men by your father's actions," I shot back, my voice steady. "He chased after anyone he could and hurt countless people. Not everyone is like him." I stared at her, waiting for her to challenge me. My hands rested tensely at my sides, ready to respond if she decided to push back. Evelyn looked frightened, but held onto a shred of pride, her body language revealing a mix of fear and stubbornness. Leaning in, I made my next move. "Your father has done terrible things. He might never face justice, but his reputation is destroyed. His business will collapse, and if you want to escape the shame, you'll have to leave everything behind." Evelyn began to shake, her composure unraveling. Tears threatened to spill, and her frustration was palpable. She clearly wanted to fight back, but couldn't muster the strength. "Actually, Evelyn," I continued, my voice sharp. It seems like you've been involved in his wrongdoings too. Her expression shifted to one of pure shock. I might need to share that with the press, I added. No, she exclaimed, shaking her head vigorously. Please, I didn't do anything wrong. It's all a misunderstanding. My father is a good man. I turned back to Jean, cutting through Evelyn's pleas. You have 2 hours to gather your things and leave, I said firmly. If you're still here when I return, I'll make a public statement. Maybe even invite the media to talk to you about what you've done here. Jean's face twisted with anger as she shouted, Leave me alone. I have nothing to regret. Really? I asked, my voice calm but biting. Nothing except being unfaithful and lying. Fine. Move out if you want, but I'll see you in court first. Get a lawyer. We'll see who gets what. Jean straightened her shoulders, her defiance returning. I will, she said, and you'll regret underestimating me. I smirked, unbothered. 2 hours, I repeated before walking out the door. I got a few blocks away when the weight of everything hit me like a tidal wave. My hands shook, and my breathing quickened as stress overwhelmed me. I pulled over, gripping the steering wheel tightly as I tried to steady myself. It took 15 minutes before I felt calm enough to drive again. Without a destination in mind, I drove aimlessly through the city, letting the miles pass in silence. Eventually, I called my father, explaining the situation. I asked him to keep Dean and Katie with him for the foreseeable future. Let Jean visit them if she wants, I said, but never let her be alone with them. I can't risk her turning them against me. He agreed, offering reassurance that the kids would be safe and loved. By the time I finally stopped for gas, I realized how far I'd gone. Filling up, I glanced at the clock. It was after 10 when I finally returned home. The house was quiet, the tension from earlier lingering in the air like a ghost. The house felt eerily empty, like a museum haunted by memories. The silence weighed on me, and sleep wouldn't come easily. I lay in bed, grappling with the mess I had set in motion. Socrates once said that an unexamined life isn't worth living. But as I reflected on the chaos I had caused, I wondered if too much examination could destroy a person. It was clear that things had gone too far to fix. My main concern now was whether the online uproar would transition into the courtroom. If it did, everything might unravel, and I could get caught in the fallout. I decided that the best course of action was to get Layla out of town, cutting any direct ties between her and the burgeoning scandal. With that decision made, I finally drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling just as drained as the night before. After my morning routine, I headed downtown for breakfast and called the kids. Dean sounded concerned, as though he was starting to sense that something wasn't right at home. I promised to talk to both him and Katie soon, but the weight of that conversation loomed heavy. Over coffee, I contacted Layla using the burner phone. She confirmed that I had kept my promises, and we finalized her plans to leave for Chicago the next day. I had moved $25,000 to her account through George, dispersing the funds in smaller amounts to avoid drawing attention. Layla now had a clean slate, a property management job arranged by George's contacts, and the chance to rebuild her life. Just as I was finishing my second cup, Vicky called with an update. 3 of the women have hired lawyers and are suing Miller for damages, she said. The papers will be served on Monday. We spoke at length. She noted the speed with which the story had escalated, likening it to the Harvey Weinstein case. Once the first woman, Layla, spoke out, it created a domino effect, Vicky explained. The timing isn't surprising, given everything happening in the world right now. That Saturday, I spent time with Dean and Katie. I sat them down and told them the truth. Their mom and I were separating because she had been unfaithful with Anthony Miller. Katie, at 12, didn't fully grasp what unfaithful meant, but Dean did. Was she with Mr. Miller, Dad? Dean asked bluntly. I nodded, feeling a pang of sadness. Katie, surprisingly perceptive for her age, asked, was it something else? Yes, I admitted. They'd been together for a long time. Katie burst into tears, while Dean remained stoic. After pulling ourselves together, we went to the driving range with my dad, hitting golf balls until our arms were sore. Dean and Katie took to it naturally, using some of my older clubs. We ended the evening with dinner at a Greek restaurant before calling it an early night. Returning to my quiet house, I endured another sleepless night. On Sunday, Jean's parents called. They wanted to know if there was any chance of reconciliation for the kids' sake. How can I fix things with someone who has been unfaithful for so long? I asked, my voice calm but firm, especially when that person was involved with someone accused of mistreating women and might have even been complicit. Their shocked gasps told me they hadn't heard the news yet, living far away in Arizona. It will all come out in court, I said before ending the call, hoping they were left with a clearer picture of their daughter. Life moved forward, slow and painful. Dean and Katie came back home, and my dad moved in to help with the transition. This arrangement gave me the time to focus on work, which was steadily growing as George and I received more referrals. By the end of the second week, the fervor surrounding Miller had started to subside. Vicky mentioned that a fourth woman had joined the class action lawsuit against him. Curiously, Layla hadn't participated, which struck me as odd given her situation. I decided to set that puzzle aside for another day. Meanwhile, I met with Jean's lawyers and my own to begin discussions about dividing our assets. The investment accounts I had set up for Dean and Katie's education were untouched and safe. My final paycheck and payments from JP Morgan had gone directly into my offshore account, shielding them from scrutiny for the time being. Her lawyers suspected I had significant funds, but had no concrete details yet. It was only a matter of time before they requested records. The process was draining, but I knew that the truth, messy and painful as it was, would eventually come to light. Until then, all I could do was prepare for what lay ahead. My offer was straightforward. I wouldn't pay Jean anything. She had a stable job and made decent money. Jean and her lawyer argued that there should have been at least $250,000 in cash and near-liquid assets. I lost it all in bad investments, I said, leaning back with a smirk. Neither of them believed me. Jean's lawyer glared, and Jean shook her head, incredulous. Take the deal, Jean, I said, my tone steady. If you don't, I'll stop paying the house expenses, and we'll end up fighting over that too. You'll run out of money for lawyers, and you'll be in a tough spot financially. Why are you being so difficult? She snapped, her voice rising in frustration. I stared at her coolly. Go ask your other husband for money, Jean. It seems like you had more of a marriage with him than with me. But hurry. He might not have much left after dealing with all those women he hurt. Jean's expression twisted, but she didn't respond. I wish I could say it ended there, but it didn't. The proceedings dragged on for months, fueled by my simmering anger. Jean's demeanor shifted with every meeting. One day, she'd accuse me of making things worse between her and Miller. The next, she'd blame me for her actions. At times, she'd ask if we could work things out, only to later threaten to come after everything I had. During one particularly heated meeting, her lawyer threatened to have her reinstated in the house immediately. I smiled calmly. Watch your step, Jean. If you push me, I'll go to every news outlet I can and share your role in this mess. Try me, and you'll see what happens. She paled, her face shifting from defiance to panic. Her lawyer said nothing, likely sensing that I wasn't bluffing. As I left the office, I noticed Evelyn sitting in the lobby. She glared at me, her expression filled with anger and contempt. I met her gaze with a smirk. You should have stayed out of it, Evelyn. Now, you'll face the consequences of your choices. 2 days later, Layla received another $5,000. Social media erupted with allegations that Evelyn had assisted her father, Anthony Miller, in his abusive behavior. Public outrage grew, with many questioning why the district attorney hadn't arrested either of them. The DA held a press conference, explaining that the investigation was still in its early stages, but the media didn't hold back. The public's fury boiled over, especially in the wake of other recent scandals, and calls for action against Evelyn intensified. Miller faced lawsuits from 4 women who had gone public, each one adding to the storm swirling around him. While the world around me spun into chaos, I began to feel the weight of my actions. Sleepless nights became the norm as I worried about the potential fallout. If this case went to court, I risked being dragged into it, and it could unravel everything I'd worked to build. 6 weeks after my return from Singapore, I was working from home when the doorbell rang. Opening it, I found Evelyn standing there, looking tense and nervous. "What do you want?" I asked coldly, not bothering to hide my irritation. "Can we talk, Adam?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "No," I said sharply. "I don't want anything to do with someone like you." I closed the door in her face, but, as expected, she rang the bell again. "Please, Adam," she pleaded. "Just hear me out." I considered her for a moment before replying. "You just want to record me and twist my words, don't you?" "I promise I won't," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "Fine," I said, holding up a hand to stop her as her face lit up. "But first, leave your bag and phone in your car." She hesitated, but eventually complied, walking back to her car and returning empty-handed. "Wait here," I said, closing the door. Inside, I set up my phone to record our conversation from a discreet spot in the living room. Then I opened the door and motioned for her to enter. "Sit down," I said firmly, watching her carefully. She hesitated at the threshold, then took a seat on the edge of a chair, her body language tense. "What are you doing?" she gasped as I patted her down, checking for hidden devices. "Just making sure everything is clear," I said, stepping back. Red-faced, she brushed her hair away and took a deep breath. "I thought you were a nice guy, Adam," she said, her tone accusatory. Her eyes searched mine, as though looking for some trace of the man she thought I was. "Talk," I said, leaning back on the couch, my expression unreadable. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to stay or flee. Finally, she began. "Well, nice guys finish last, you know," I said, my tone flat. Evelyn nodded, as though I had confirmed something she already suspected. "I know it's you, Adam," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You started this whole mess." I stared at her without a word, my expression blank. She probably saw me as the villain in her story, and I wasn't about to dissuade her of that notion. "Stop this, Adam," she pleaded. I remained silent, watching as she shifted tactics. "I know you're hurt by Jean's affair with my dad." "Who wouldn't be?" she said, her voice softening. "But this talk about my dad hurting women is a lie, and it needs to end. You have to take it back." I couldn't help but laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. "There's nothing I could do, Evelyn," I replied. "It's in the hands of the courts now." "Please, Adam," she said, her tone more desperate. "Just stop this." "I know you can." I smiled, the bitterness still lingering in the corners of my mouth. "Now that your life is falling apart, you want my help? Where were you when your dad was ruining mine? Where were you when he was tearing my family apart?" Her face turned bright red, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "That's right," I continued, my voice cold. "You were helping it happen, making sure Jean was ready to fall into his arms." We locked eyes for a long moment, the silence between us heavy. I could see the gears turning in her mind as she tried to think of a way to convince me. Finally, she asked, "When will you stop, Adam? When will it be enough?" Tears began to fall from her eyes, and she seemed to shrink before me. This wasn't an act. She was truly broken. "Not until your family is completely destroyed, Evelyn," I said, my voice slow and deliberate. Her eyes widened in fear, the gravity of my words sinking in. "There's no way to stop this. There will be no pause, no peace, until everything the Millers have built is in ruins." She sat in silence, processing my words. Then, to my surprise, she asked something that caught me off guard. "Do you want to get revenge on me, Adam? Do you want to control me completely?" Her hands fidgeted nervously, and she avoided my gaze. I studied her, noticing the vulnerability she tried to hide. Evelyn was in her mid-30s, single, and alone after a recent breakup, according to her social media. She was fit and attractive, but her confidence had clearly been shaken. I raised an eyebrow, considering her question. "Are you suggesting that we go to your father's hospital room with Jean, so I could be with you there, Evelyn?" I asked, my voice mocking. "And then afterward, we involve your father while Jean watches?" Her face turned pale, and she stood abruptly, her expression a mix of shock and disgust. "You're awful," she shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. I stepped closer, gently gripping her arms. "I may seem harsh, but I'm not like your father," I said, my tone low and steady. "I didn't take advantage of people when they were at their lowest. He did. His choices are what will bring him down, and they'll bring you down with him. Everything he built, everything you have, it will all crumble. Evelyn staggered toward the door, her composure unraveling. She hurried to her car, visibly shaken, and drove off, her movements unsteady. I stood in the doorway, watching her leave. A strange mix of satisfaction and sadness settled over me. I had hurt her, and part of me felt vindicated. But another part, the part that still clung to a shred of decency, felt a pang of regret for how cruel I'd been. Needing to clear my head, I poured myself a drink. The rest of the week blurred into a haze of legal meetings and work. George and I were researching new opportunities. A promising IT company listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and a natural gas venture in the Indian Ocean on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. We were preparing to present these to our investor group. Meanwhile, the class action lawsuit against Anthony Miller was gaining traction. Evelyn and her legal team scrambled to settle the matter outside of court, hoping to minimize the damage. The district attorney, unsure how to proceed with the case against a man on his deathbed, hesitated. The world around me felt suspended in chaos, the outcome of this storm still uncertain. All I could do was wait and see where the pieces would fall. Some intriguing details leaked from the private discussions between the accusers and the Millers. When Evelyn denied the women's allegations, dismissing them as lies, one of the women leaned forward, her voice cold and deliberate. "Do you want me to describe exactly what he was like?" she asked. Her tone left no room for doubt. She added that Miller often made his intentions clear. The tension in the room escalated quickly, leaving Evelyn visibly shaken. The fallout was swift and devastating. The Millers lost nearly everything. They sold off all the company's properties, and each woman received payouts exceeding $2 million. The exact amount wasn't disclosed, but it was substantial enough to completely dissolve MRE. Despite the financial closure, I still needed something personal to close this chapter of my life. I went to the hospital, walking into Miller's room with an air of authority that discouraged any questions from the staff. As I stood by his bedside, I looked at the man who had caused so much damage to my life and others. "You hurt my wife, Miller," I said firmly, "and now your life is in ruins. You'll die knowing your reputation is destroyed, your company has failed, and countless people look down on you." I didn't mask the contempt in my voice. "Was it worth it?" He didn't respond, his pale face betraying no emotion. I turned and left, feeling nothing but a hollow sense of justice. Miller died 2 days later. Evelyn arranged for him to be cremated, and only 5 people attended the small gathering afterward. Jean was one of them. She approached me afterward, asking to take Dean and Katie with her. "That's not happening," I said firmly. "You would do that, wouldn't you?" she snapped, her face a mixture of fear and anger. It reminded me of Evelyn's expression before. "I had no idea you could be so vengeful," Jean continued, her voice trembling. "You destroyed him, didn't you? And for what? Because he and I were close?" Her words spilled out, her tears streaming down her face. "You overreacted and hurt so many people," she said, her voice breaking. I stood my ground. "You started this, Jean. You could have been honest with me. You could have told me you wanted someone else. It would have hurt, but it would have been truthful. Instead, you chose disrespect." She hesitated, her voice softening. "I loved Tony," she confessed. "He gave me what I needed. When he was with me, he was fully present. With you, it always felt like your job was more important than I was." She paused, pulling a tissue from her handbag to dab at her eyes. "Once we had Dean and Katie, I felt invisible. It was always your work and the kids. I was just an afterthought. I needed someone who made me feel like I mattered." Her words hung in the air. I could have let her sit with her memories, but I didn't. I pulled out my phone. "Listen to this," I said, pressing play. Miller's wheezing voice echoed from the recording. "No, nothing was worth this. You've ruined everything I built over a lifetime." I let out a cold laugh in the recording. "You brought this on yourself, Miller. I messed things up for you." Miller's voice grew more desperate. "How? How did you know? What? How did you find out about my favors?" A long pause followed, during which I started laughing in the recording. "I didn't know," I replied on the tape, my laughter growing louder. Gene froze, staring at me in shock. "He confessed it all," I said, meeting her gaze. "And he lost everything." Her face crumpled as she sank to the floor, unable to process the weight of what had happened. I walked away, leaving her with her grief. She was no longer my concern. Epilogue. When MRE began selling everything to scrape together cash, I bought the house they were planning to use for the New Horizons home. I got it for a great price, a final, satisfying conclusion to the downfall of Anthony Miller and the Miller's empire. It took some time to bring everything together, but in the end, it all fell into place perfectly. After the deal was finalized, I placed ads in local papers and announced on the radio that I had purchased the New Horizons home. My plan was to transform it into a proper halfway house for women in need, one that would always be run by women, with no men in positions of authority. I renamed it the Joy Carter Home, in honor of my mother. When I told my dad, he cried and hugged me tightly. Dean and Katie were proud of the decision, and it felt like a small victory for all of us. The home was placed in a trust, with my father and me as trustees, alongside the 4 women who had taken legal action against Miller. They were thrilled to contribute and even donated portions of their settlements to ensure the home's success. Local and regional news outlets began calling it a Phoenix project, lauding the initiative as a story of resilience and community rebuilding. Although the media praised me and the women behind the project, I tried to stay out of the spotlight. For me, it was less about recognition and more about serving the community. And if it helped me appear responsible in front of the judge during my divorce proceedings, all the better. In the end, Jean was granted primary custody of Dean and Katie. I was ordered to pay child support until they turned 18, but there was no alimony. She could stay in the house until then, but was required to pay half the mortgage. During one of our meetings to divide assets, Jean accused me of hiding money. "Let it go," I warned her. "Otherwise, I'll make things difficult for you." Surprisingly, she backed down, choosing her words carefully from then on. I realized this was what fear looked like, her fear of me and what I might do if pushed. I assured her she'd receive a good amount when the house was eventually sold, and that seemed to put the matter to rest. After months of legal wrangling, our divorce was finalized. I bought a 3-bedroom condo for the kids to visit, and since Jean was often busy with her real estate work on weekends, I had them nearly every weekend. Though I missed them during my frequent travels to the Far East, life wasn't as bad as it could have been. Sometimes, I even laughed at myself for how things had unfolded. It had been tough, but it could have been worse. Jean's relationship with Evelyn deteriorated shortly after I shared the recording of my conversation with Miller. The edited version I sent out, where Miller admitted to wrongdoing, spread far beyond what I had expected. Evelyn left town a few months later, and I never heard from her again. In Chicago, I met Layla, whose real name was Leanne Roxton. She looked great, thriving in her new job. "Did you know?" I asked her over drinks. "It was like an open secret," she replied. "No one talked about it openly. Everyone was too scared of losing their place to stay. Why didn't you come forward?" I wondered aloud. She laughed, shaking her head. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't hurt myself, but I reached out to a couple of women I knew to see if they'd share their stories for $5,000. Some agreed, but others wouldn't budge. She looked at me defiantly, daring me to judge her. I didn't. The second woman I talked to was Rita French, she continued. She got upset when I first called and hung up. But a few days later, she was the first one to speak out on that radio show when Evelyn was on air. I didn't even have to pay her. She said she'd held back long enough. Layla took a sip of her drink, smiling slightly. After that, everything snowballed. By the time they were suing Miller, I was in Chicago, far removed from it all. I didn't even know what was happening until it was already over. "You could have made a lot of money," I said, feeling a pang of sympathy. "Maybe," she said, shrugging. "But you gave me a good start, Adam. And for that, I'm grateful." With those words, my journey for justice finally felt complete. Against all odds, my actions felt justified, at least to me. It had been more than I expected. Still, I couldn't shake the question that lingered in the back of my mind. Was I a bad person? The Millers had crumbled like characters in a tragic story, and I had been the one pulling the strings. I had learned hard lessons about revenge, and I'd acted on them in ways I never imagined. Financially, things were looking up. My business was thriving, and George was considering selling me his share so he could retire. Dean and Katie adjusted like most teenagers do, focusing on school, friends, and sports. My role in their lives shifted from central figure to convenient driver and occasional mentor. Life, as it always does, moved on. About 4 years after the divorce, Jean began dating an older man. They lived together for a while, and after a couple of years, they got married. Dean and Katie said he was a nice guy, and they seemed genuinely happy with him in their lives. As for me, I was free and easy, or at least that's what I told myself. It was just a way of saying I wasn't in any serious relationships. Deep down, I knew I still struggled with trust. My experiences had left scars that weren't easy to heal. After some time, and with a little nudge from my father, I decided to start seeing a counselor. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a step in the right direction. Slowly, I began working on feeling better about myself and life in general. The process was long and challenging, and though I made progress, I knew there was still a lot of ground to cover. Hey everyone, welcome to my new channel. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave your comments below to help us grow and bring you even more incredible stories. Your support means the world to me. Thank you so much for being part of this journey.